4 years ago, I rented an Airbnb to stay in for the holidays. I was seeing my family for the week of Christmas, so I got a place that was just a few miles away. When I arrived on December 20th, everything was exactly as I thought it was. The place was a very regular house in a very normal neighborhood. Overall, I was satisfied. I'd gotten there around 6 o'clock on that first day though, and I didn't feel like going out to see anyone until I'd gotten a good night's rest. So I stayed in and relaxed for the rest of the night, watching some TV and even getting a little bit of work done as well. I got in bed just before 10 and fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, I slowly woke to a noise coming from downstairs. I was still half asleep and didn't even check the time, but it sounded like a few small thumps against the wall coming from somewhere in the house. As I listened to the noises, I didn't really feel worried or anything, but rather just thought that it was the house making these sounds. I only stayed awake for a minute before drifting into sleep again, and I don't recall waking up any other times during the night. By morning, I had forgotten and didn't even think about those noises I was hearing. Again, I was pretty sure it was just the AC unit or something. Anyway, I let my family know I'd made it into town, and we got our plans set for dinner at their place. I relaxed at the Airbnb for the whole morning and afternoon until I was ready to head out. I grabbed my bag and keys, then walked up to the front door to exit the house. But when I opened it, I was face to face with a man standing right in front of me on the porch. It completely caught me off guard, and I just stood there looking at him for a second before even saying anything. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man didn't knock or ring the doorbell, which made me start thinking of how long he could have been standing there for, and just why he was here to begin with. He didn't respond to my question though, and instead just nodded, then walked away. I watched him go down to the sidewalk, and just continue walking down the street until he was gone. I can't see any situation where this wouldn't be strange and creepy. Why was he at the Airbnb? And for how long was he standing there without knocking? I made sure the place was locked up, then drove to my parents' house for dinner with the family. I brought up the situation as an interesting story, and everyone else seemed to think it was just as creepy as I'd thought. Dinner was still nice, and we had plenty of other great conversations, catching up on life and everything. But that whole night, I couldn't stop thinking about that man, and if my things I'd left at the Airbnb were going to be stolen or something. I ended up leaving the dinner get-together around 9, and getting back to the Airbnb 15 minutes later. I parked in the driveway and walked up to the front door, looking around for any obvious signs of someone having been there while I was gone, but I didn't see anything. I unlocked the door and stepped in. I walked down to the end of the hallway and into the kitchen, dropping my keys and bag on the counter, but then there was a sudden thump. It was just the same as the ones I'd heard the previous night, but now that I was downstairs, it was far louder and clearly coming from one side of the house. I slowly stepped into the room near where the sound was coming from, but then the thump came again from a door right next to me. I jumped back, getting a surge of adrenaline, and then after staring at the door for a few seconds, I could hear the faint sound of heavy breathing from the other side. I grabbed my keys and ran for my car. I still didn't know exactly what was going on, but I was not going to stay to find out on my own. I called 911 and waited for them to arrive. When they did, I watched them go in and search for a few minutes. Then they came out and told me something horrifying. The door the person was behind was the garage door, which showed signs of distress from the person likely trying to break the lock and get inside. Unknown to me, there was a side door connected to the garage that led outside, which had been left unlocked by whoever had stayed here before me. I didn't ever plan to use the garage, so I never checked it. Whether the man I'd seen on the porch was the same person that was in the garage is unknown. But just knowing that I was asleep while someone was right below me, trying to break into the house, is terrifying. What they were trying to achieve after breaking in, we have no way of knowing. Obviously after that, though, I went and stayed at a hotel for the rest of the week. But I still find myself thinking about that situation even 4 years later. A few weeks ago, I went on a trip where I'd rented out an Airbnb townhouse. I was staying in a small town that was near some trails I wanted to hike. I'd never been there before, or really had any idea of the place I was staying. I just knew it was a relatively small town that was in a convenient area for me. The drive took 9 hours total, so by the time I got to the Airbnb, it was getting late. It was on a street that had multiple other townhouses on it, but once I found it, I parked on the road and got my things up to the door. The place looked decent on the outside, definitely not very new or anything, but nothing that I wasn't already expecting. I texted the owner to let them know I'd made it, since I didn't see a passcode to the door anywhere in my emails. I waited for a couple minutes, just standing there and looking out at the street. Then I heard a door open nearby, and a man walked around the corner with a smile on his face. He greeted me as the Airbnb host, then let me into the place and said he'd be right next door if I needed anything. I wasn't expecting that, but he at least left quickly and didn't make anything too weird. I set up my things in the bedroom and had a look around the house, and I went to bed soon after. The next day, I ate a quick breakfast, then drove out to a trail and hiked it for a good 4 hours. I got back to the townhouse at 7, but when I entered, something felt different. Some of the things in my room were off, like they'd been moved slightly. Nothing that I know of was missing, but I don't know, I just had a feeling it had been tampered with. Aside from my unevidenced suspicions, though, there really weren't any other things to actually prove someone had been inside while I was gone. After looking around for 30 minutes, I was more sure that this was me just being nervous about staying in an unfamiliar area. I forgot about it and heated up a frozen meal, then ate dinner on the couch while watching YouTube on my phone. At 11 p.m., I went to bed. This was a single-story townhouse, so the bedroom was at the end of the main hallway, opposite of the front door. I was always used to sleeping upstairs, so it was a little hard to get comfortable as I laid in bed and tried to sleep. I kept falling asleep for a few minutes, then waking up and repeating this process. But then, maybe an hour into the night, I was laying there awake, waiting to go back to sleep, when I heard something from outside the room. A door softly creaking open from across the house. It sounded intentional, like they were trying to open it as quietly as possible. I sat up in my bed and looked at the door as I listened, but I didn't hear anything else. After a minute, I got up and went to the bedroom door, cracking it open just enough to see through. Down the hallway, I could see the dim glow of the porch light lighting up the area where the front door was, indicating that the front door was partially open. I carefully and quietly closed my door and locked it, then moved to the back of the room and quietly called the police. In the middle of the phone call, I heard a creak right outside the bedroom door, and when I looked at the bottom, I could see the outlined shadow of someone standing there. I immediately stopped talking, waiting for them to walk away before continuing to report to the operator. Thankfully, nothing else seemed to happen as I waited for the officer to get there. They were gone by then, but everything showed that someone had been inside, including shoe prints all over the place, so there was no doubt even to the cops. But while I for some reason had my mind set on it being the Airbnb host, they didn't find anything to support that, other than the front door being open without any struggle. There's also not much to say on whether they had been inside the house while I was gone during the day. With nothing missing though, and them coming back only once I was there, I think their intentions had to do with me. It still haunts my thoughts, wondering what could have happened, and if they are out there, still trying. Last New Year's, me and my two best friends decided it would be fun to get together and rent out a house for the night. We weren't big on going to huge parties, but just enjoyed hanging out among our small group. Also, all of us lived in dorm rooms, so having a house to ourselves for once sounded like a great time even without partying. My friend Jason rented out an Airbnb on the outskirts of the town we were in. I carpooled with my other friend Christian, and we met Jason there on New Year's Eve around noon. This place was more of a cabin than a normal house, being all wood and having the typical cabin features. There were other similar-looking cabin houses around, but they all had a decent spacing between them, so it kind of felt like we were out there alone. The inside wasn't as great, but this was one of the cheaper places available, so none of us were expecting luxury. We spent the day just hanging out in the living room and talking, and around 6, Christian went out to the store to grab some snacks and drinks. During this time, Jason and I were still sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. We looked at each other in surprise, knowing it was really weird for anyone to be out here and knocking on the door to an Airbnb. I got up and looked out the peephole, seeing some guy standing on the doorstep. I noticed the door had one of those metal latches on it, so I flipped it over and opened the door just enough to see them. I wouldn't usually answer the door to a random guy, but being in someone else's house, I wasn't sure if maybe it was the host or something. The guy looked at me, and I was instantly aware of his displeased look. He seemed angry about something, and it became more blunt when he opened his mouth. He told me in a disrespectful and stubborn tone that we needed to be quiet tonight and not disturb the entire neighborhood. The way he said it was almost threatening, and as if we'd already been making noise, but we hadn't even done anything loud, nor were we planning to. And all the houses were so far apart, even if he was a neighbor, there's no possible way he'd hear anything, unless we were lighting up fireworks or something. I really wasn't in the mood to argue, so I just said sure, and closed the door in his face. But not even a second later, he banged on the door again. I ignored him that time, making a face at Jason like this guy was crazy. We heard him leave after a moment, and when Christian got back, we told him about the encounter, and he almost didn't even believe us. The next 3 hours went by quick, as we watched a movie and played some games on Jason's Switch. Then, come almost midnight, we heard something outside. It sounded like someone dropping something on the ground, and a few seconds later, the piercing sound of glass shattering came from right outside the door. All of us stood up and ran to look out the window, seeing that same guy from earlier standing by Christian's car, which now had glass covering it from his shattered windshield. The guy was holding a metal baseball bat and looked like he was in some psychotic state, pacing around and just going crazy. Christian was pissed, going to the door and storming outside to confront him. Both Jason and I went to stop him, but before we even got to the doorway, a gunshot echoed through the cabin. I stopped in place, knowing what had likely happened, but it almost felt like a miracle when I saw Christian sprint back inside and lock the door behind him. A few more shots went off, hitting the side of the cabin, and followed by the man swinging the bat against the front door. Then, just as suddenly as it all started, the man just ran away. After an investigation, it was found that he wasn't even one of the neighbors of the Airbnb. Nobody seems to know who he was, or where he lived, or even why he went absolutely insane. It was just an incredibly dangerous, unpredictable encounter that almost took our lives. This happened a couple years ago when I was 16. It was a warm summer night. And nights like these, me and my friend would often go grab a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of beer each, and go outside to enjoy them. Come from a really small town where everybody is somehow connected, so the only way for us to drink and smoke without our parents knowing was to do so in secluded places. Luckily, the town is surrounded by huge forests. We are both very familiar with them since we practically grew up there. This one time, it was night as usual. We both grabbed our forbidden contraband, some flashlights, and we headed out. We took the path through the long meadow, which ended at the edge of the forest. From there led a path through the forest, by which it's a 20-minute walk back to the town in steep downhill terrain. At the place where the meadow and the forest meet, there is a gazebo with a fireplace where people go for picnics. As we were walking through the meadow, we would stop a few times to ensure from afar that the gazebo was unoccupied. It was around 11 p.m. and the night was incredibly dark. Even though we were out in the open, we had to use our flashlights to see anything. We made sure that the air was clear. We approached the gazebo to light our first cigarette. We were both just standing there, puffing and talking, while always scouting our surroundings with the beams of our flashlights. After maybe 5 minutes, we decided to take the path through the forest back to town. We walked about 30 meters, at which point we couldn't see the place where we were previously standing. That's when we heard it. From the gazebo, where we were standing just seconds earlier, came a lone terrifying scream. It sounded as if somebody, a man by the sound of it, was being cut to pieces while still very much alive. The kind of scream that turns your blood to ice instantly. After the first scream, there was a pause for a few seconds. During this time, we were both so scared that we couldn't even move. Then it started again, even louder and more terrifying. The second scream snapped us back to reality, and without a word, we just started sprinting to the rough terrain, not once looking back. At this point, I was so pumped up with adrenaline that I couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat resonating in my ears. We've never ran that fast before, and we didn't stop until we reached the lights of town. When we finally did, we both just sat on the sidewalk under a lamppost, panting and gasping for air. Nobody said anything for a good 30 minutes. After a while, we started talking about it. We came up with the conclusion that either somebody was having fun at our expense, or somebody really got hurt. At the end, we decided to head back there the first thing in the morning. But surprise, surprise, no signs of anyone being injured or anyone struggling. We decided that it was just someone playing pranks on us. However, to this day it keeps gnawing at me. Something just doesn't add up. We were standing there for quite some time, so the person must have been very well hidden. On the other hand, it would be almost impossible for anyone to just walk in there without any light, since it was so dark. And even if he had some kind of torch, we would certainly spot him. Anyway, screaming man in the forest, let's not meet. I live in the Pacific Northwest in a pretty small town, about an hour from Seattle. Really close to my home is an enormous state forest. For my birthday, my dad suggested that we go for a hike in that forest. I was uneasy at first because this forest does have somewhat of a history. There is a legal business here, and the majority of it is in that state forest because it is anyone's real jurisdiction. Basically, you should hope you aren't spotted as a witness to drug operations or illegal logging. To make matters worse, the forest is used as a dumping ground as well as a remote site to commit murders. Murders don't really exceed one every 3 to 4 years, though. Ones that happen in the forest are generally drug-related, while the bodies dumped there vary in motive, 2 of which are believed to be victims of Ted Bundy, by the way. There is also a minimum security correction center in the south end of the forest. So on an early spring weekend, I went for a day hike with my dad. How did this even happen? My dad managed to convince me that we're in no danger because no one is already after us for anything. There's no motive, and by extension, no reason for alarm, and the forest is giant. The odds are low. Going in the overcast and rainy off-season, we knew there should be no foot or motor traffic, which is nice. We started out in the southeastern portion, walking through the occasional clear cut. That after the first mile, we moved into dense forest. There wasn't much to see, and it was terribly muddy. I had little to distract me but the sound of my own footsteps, till I heard other footsteps. Footsteps were loud and deliberate, as a human's would be, but there weren't more hikers. They were coming from the trees above. I was uncomfortable, but also armed with a hunting knife. I decided it was probably an animal, despite seeing none or even hearing birds. A short while later, I heard low-sounding voices. This I could only think, if I don't bother them, they won't bother me, so I tried to forget it. I am cursed with incredibly good hearing, though, making it hard to get rid of my suspicions. Walking on, we passed a seemingly still body of water to the left. It was weird. It connected to a creek on both sides, but it was large and unmoving, like a pond. Additionally, there was no life of any kind. No fish, hardly any plants but brown algae and thick yellow grass. On the right, the forest was ridiculously dense, with a few spur trails that disappear into it within a few feet. All of it a bit weird, but not suspicious. We kept walking to a small waterfall about 100 feet ahead. My dad had become busy taking pictures. I surveyed the area and turned around, looking back at the trail. Then I saw him. In the distance, a tall, lanky man in grungy-looking clothing, practically leapt out from the side of the trail with the pond, and in another bound across the trail into the trees on the other side. I assumed he continued down a spur trail to who knows where. It was so quick that I didn't even react. I saw him, and he was gone into the trees. My dad decided that we should head back after taking a sufficient amount of pictures, and as we headed down, there was a small organized pile of fern leaves in the center of the trail, points in the direction that we were heading. We didn't know what to make of it because we didn't see anyone on the trail that day. Well, he didn't. I'd like to begin by describing myself because I believe it's relevant to the story. I have to assume that I'm not the average author here. I'm 25, male and a bit above average height. I've been doing sports 5 to 6 times a week since I graduated high school. Gym, running, CrossFit, and swimming. And any team sport my friends decide to play at any given time. My favorite hobbies are mountaineering, hiking, and bouldering. I've just recently purchased a new pair of high-altitude mountaineering boots because it's near the end of summer season and they were on sale. The plan is to wear them in the Alps next summer on a few ascents. I live in a European capital, one that's surrounded by wonderful nature with many trails and opportunities for hiking. I decided to break in my boots last Saturday. More specifically because it would have been my granddad's birthday and he also loved hiking before he died. These boots are overkill for these woods, but I needed to try them. I selected a nice route that's around 25 kilometers and set off at about 9 in the morning. It rained just the day before, so I expected a fair amount of mud and not so many people as they are easily scared off by the weather. Since the summer was excruciatingly hot, it was a nice change of temperature for me, especially between trees and such, where it's a few degrees cooler than in the city. In the not-so-distant past, my dad would have definitely joined me on this hike, but she's turning 14 this year and she doesn't enjoy long-distant walks anymore. My girlfriend had to do something for work on short notice, so I knew from the moment I woke up I'll be doing this hike alone. The first half of the hike was perfect. The altitude difference along the trail is minimal. I barely broke a sweat and I misjudged how many people would be out due to the storm the day before. I met at most 6 to 7 people during the first 2 to 3 hours, and most of them were mere cross-country runners. It's worth mentioning that I wasn't walking quickly. I stopped on many occasions to take pictures or study animal tracks. There are a lot of deer and wild boars in these woods. Nothing more menacing. Not animals anyway, but I won't get ahead of myself. Between 12 and 1, the path ran to an actual road, one where cars can go. This floor is asphalt, but deep in the forest and can only be used to reach certain landmarks that are also in the forest, so cars seldom go here. My trail required me to take this road for a few hundred meters. As I was walking along the road, I heard a car approach from behind me. It went past me, not too quickly or too slowly. was an older green SUV with a fresh registration. You can tell by the license plate. Probably an import. Anyway, I thought nothing of it at the time. Then I heard it come back. Drove past me for the second time, now very slowly, and I could clearly see two men sitting in the front seats, wearing baseball caps and sunglasses. Both had stubble and beard game going on as well. I assume they were gamekeepers, even though those cars have a crest on the hood and on both front doors. As I hike a fair amount, I know these things. I see them around quite a bit. They would also not be driving a car like this. I have Jeeps which are more suitable for the forest. Still, I felt no discomfort, and again, I thought nothing of it. Then my trail left the asphalt road and began snaking into the woods again. I walked ahead serenely, gazing at trees and whatnot, and I suddenly had the strange sensation that something or someone was behind me. The engine sound was becoming more and more clear as well. At this point, the trail was quite narrow, but if for whatever reason you'd want to drive a car on it, you could, just about. And when I turned around, the SUV I mentioned before was basically in my face. It was an arm's length away from me, and it stopped just as I had. I looked at the driver, who was staring back, as I can only assume as he was wearing sunglasses. I calmly asked him, "What's wrong? Shall I let you go?" in a polite tone as his window was rolled down. He didn't speak. He slowly started reversing, and he soon disappeared behind a curve. Now, I was quite uncomfortable. I also noticed that he was alone in the car, unlike earlier. I listened intently, standing still, since I wasn't sure what was going on. At this point, I was not scared, but there was a faint feeling of unease in the air, and bad thoughts began gathering in the back of my mind. I heard the car, and the engine, stop just behind the curve. I heard a door open and shut, but nothing from that point on. I turned around and kept walking towards my destination at a much faster pace than before. And now, admittedly, I was a bit scared. I didn't understand why he didn't answer and why he just reversed and left without a word. Wasn't sure what to make of it, and I had no desire to ask him again or to see him again for that matter. I had just walked enough for these unpleasant thoughts to slowly be erased from my mind. As I had been drinking a lot of water as I usually do, I decided to take a piss. I saw a perfect spot, a very narrow path off my trail that led quite clearly to a little hunting tower. I don't know what they're called in English. Wooden structures. A couple meters tall, very simple, where hunters can sit and wait for their prey. I walked over to the tower and put my bag down by the ladder that led up it and began pissing. I was also interested in checking Google Maps to see where I was, but since there was no signal, I decided to check my own map. I also had another sip of water. I had been camping there for a good few minutes before I headed back to the trail from where I deviated from to take a leak. Right before I arrived back to the main trail, I thought to myself how extremely quiet it was. No wind, no noise of any kind. Absolutely nothing. This made me realize just a moment later how alone I was, except for the man who was standing maybe 50 meters away from me on the trail, in the direction where I was headed. I only saw this as soon as I stepped back on that trail, since the small one to the tower was very well hidden by trees and you couldn't see the main trail as it was running perpendicularly to the small one. I looked at him and I was instantly chilled to the very bone. He was dressed in tactical clothing with a baseball bat on his head. The only reason he was standing still, I believe, was a moment of surprise that I had appeared from a place where he didn't expect me to appear from. At this point, I was fully and utterly alarmed. He was holding a rifle that had a scope on it. Had this happened without the incident with the SUV, I would have probably walked on along the trail, thinking he's just a hunter. However, in light of the strange encounter with the SUV, from which the second man was missing, something in me snapped instantly. In hindsight, it's also illegal to hunt in these woods this time of year. I figured in a matter of 2 seconds that I was going to sprint through the woods until exhaustion, towards and past the tower, as it seemed natural to do at the time. If there is no malicious intent on this man's behalf, or the others, he'll just think I'm an idiot and forget about me in 2 minutes. If I'm right, it's the best call I will have ever made. And for fuck's sake, he began running towards me. Adrenaline blossoming within me, I began sprinting away. I sprinted past the tower and deep into the bushes, not sparing my legs as I was wearing shorts and a thermal jumper. I crashed through branches, small trees, and slipped on several occasions. I really did sprint until I was exhausted. It must have been several kilometers. I even crossed some smaller trails, but didn't even bother to look away. My pulse was a billion the whole time. I began checking my phone for a signal, but still nothing. I was already really angry at myself for not memorizing the license plate. After a while, I began power walking, but still off trail, straight ahead, in a direction that I knew would sooner or later lead me out of the woods. When my phone finally got a signal, I told the story to several people frantically. No one took me too seriously. They said I was overreacting and whatnot. You must have misunderstood the situation. Well, I'll let you decide for yourselves if I did or not. Finally, I reached a trail that led directly to a cute little town that borders this rather large forest. It felt like eternity, but I walked the last kilometer to the main square, took off my jumper and put it in my bag. At least that looked a little different from far away. Waited for a bus that took me back to a station near my car, rather anxiously. After the bus ride, during which I studied each car on the road, I walked back to my car, got in, and drove home. A dog welcomed me like I was coming back from a 2-year deployment. Dogs are just amazing like that. She must have felt that something shook me up. Spent the afternoon contemplating my life in the bathtub. The boots destroyed my feet, but they aren't meant to be sprinted in for large periods of time. I called the forest gamekeeper's office, and I inquired about whether they have such cars in service as the one I came across, and they do not. The gamekeepers also don't typically work in pairs. Like 99% of the time, they are alone. I told them my story, and it took me a lot more seriously than my friends. They assured me that the police wouldn't. No one could have been legally hunting in the area during summer either. I've been reading local news, but nothing extraordinary has been reported yet. I really hope that nothing will be reported. Gentlemen in the empty forest at lunchtime, that's not me. This happened to my roommate and I 2 years ago. When we drove into the National Forest just outside the town we live in, we go to a small college in New England, about 3 hours from any major city. For context, this forest has quite a few urban legends surrounding it, and the local community, although they do go there often, have a lot of superstitions about how to be safe while there. I had just broken up with my partner and my roommate since I was feeling down. Finals were just around the corner, so she decided to help me get my mind off things, suggested that we go to a nice spot that she had found last week, and just chill. We took a couple of beers with us and we drove to the secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road in the forest, I saw a couple of things that unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground the road was on. We saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. Creepy shit, but we didn't really give it a second thought and kept driving. We got to a clearing and we parked our car behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV and started just talking and playing music. About 10 minutes into this, 2 cars appeared from the road and parked in the clearing. My friend didn't pay them attention. Instead, she kept talking. But as I was facing them from where I sat, I couldn't stop seeing what they did. A guy popped out of each car, talked for a few minutes, and then I saw them take out a long object covered in a dark plastic bag from the back of one of the cars. This is when I noticed these guys have guns, and not like shotguns, which I see often in this town, but handguns. Then they started lighting the bag on fire. I told my friend to get down, and she turned around and saw them for the first time. Black smoke was rising from the bag, and between trying to keep my head down and steal glances at them, I saw them take out a second object, and heard them shoot at it. Right before they set it on fire. I don't know how long my friend and I were lying there in silence, but it was definitely enough to let the terror sink in, and whisper to each other how much we loved each other, just in case this is what we thought it was. At some point, I looked up and saw that they were pointing at our car, and saw them walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or trying to look for us. All I know is that right then, I told my friend to jump into the driver's seat and make a run for it. I shut the back door, and between that and the car starting up, the guys heard it and started running towards us, then ran towards one of the cars and hopped in. We went over a hill, and driving way above what was safe for dirt roads on the hillside, we lost them. We drove to a neighboring town and roamed around for a while, just to make sure no one was following us, before we went back to our dorm. That day we tried to make fun of the whole situation and got really drunk, before finally breaking down and crying, for knowing that we had seen something we were not supposed to. We were at first terrified of telling anyone, but eventually did tell officers on campus, who contacted the police, but never found anything. So before I started this story, I just want to let you know that I'm French, so I apologize in advance if I make any mistakes. And as I just said, I live in France, and this happened to me the summer after the lockdown ended. I went to my grandparents to spend a few weeks. Grandparents lived in a small city in the north of France, and they have a dog who's quite a big dog. When I was really young, I lived at my grandparents for a year. At the time, the dog was only a puppy. Her name is Chippy, in French, which kind of means like little devil in English, but in an affectionate way. Considering when I was living there, I played with her a lot. We are both really close, and that will have its importance later. Two of my hobbies are long walks and running. Thus, every morning I was going out for a long walk with my dog. There's a trek that follows a path through the forest, then there's a small hill, and on top of that, a big place with lots of field there. I run there a lot, so I know the place very well, and the air is fresh, and the view is quite beautiful. So I was going there with the dog every day. I was also helping my grandparents to have her doing lots of exercise. The first time we went there, nothing special happened at all. We just enjoyed our walk. It's about 6 to 7 kilometers, so basically an hour walk for us. The next day, when we arrived on top of the hill, in the field, it was probably around 10 p.m., but there was still some light because it's summer. There were 3 other persons walking in the fields, and they were younger than me, probably 15 to 16. I also noticed that they were smoking, so my guess was that they used to come here so they couldn't be seen by their parents. We just went past them, though. I greeted them, and they greeted back. Once again, nothing special there. For about a week straight, I did this whole walk around the same time, 10 p.m., and every time I passed by those 3 guys, with nothing special happening, and it was perfectly fine to me this way. The second week, though, as usual, I went for the walk with my dog, and arrived at the fields. There was only one of those 3 boys this time, and he wasn't smoking. When he saw me, I was at the entrance of the field just after the little hill climb, so the entrance of the forest was just behind me. He did a sign with his hand to catch my attention and asked if I had a lighter, which I actually did have in my pocket. I told him, yeah, sure. So he walked to me, with both of his hands in the pockets of his hoodie. When he came near, for some reason I felt a shiver. It's crazy how sometimes your instinct knows there's a problem, but you don't listen to it because something looks weird to you. I handed over the lighter when he passed by. At that moment, my dog was staring at him. And everything happened really fast. He did a really fast movement with his hand, coming from the hoodie, and I only saw something shining. Just had a reflex of throwing myself back, so hard that I fell down. I just realized that it was a knife he was holding, and he just tried to stab me. What saved me is my dog, God bless her. When she saw the guy trying to stab me, she jumped on him and he fell down. As I said before, very big dog. I immediately got up on my feet and heard something from behind me. From the entrance of the forest, I saw 2 guys wearing animal masks running to me. They were probably the 2 friends. In this moment, your brain sort of acts for itself. Me and Chippy started running immediately as fast as we could. I heard the worst possible thing from the guy who got up as well. Catch him. Don't let him go. This moment I was totally terrified. I was just running and running. I was hearing them running behind me. I was only thinking, how long will they follow me, and who the hell are they? This was the first time I was really happy to be a runner. I was clearly faster than those guys, and that totally saved me, because they chased for something that felt like an eternity to me. Fortunately, at the end of the field, there's another entrance to the forest, and this time, it's a descent with the road at the end. I heard the steps of 3 guys vanishing as I arrived at the end of the forest, though I didn't stop running until I arrived at my grandparents' house and locked myself in the house. Caught a big breath and gave my dog a huge hug. I saw in her eyes that she totally understood what happened, and I had never been so happy to have her in my life. After that, I told everything to my grandparents and we called the police, but they didn't find anyone. I don't know what these guys wanted, but the animal mask really makes me think about some kind of Satanists. I really don't want to know anyway. I still do long walks with Chippy the hero dog, and I just go earlier now and at places with a little bit more people. I remember back when I was in high school, during my junior year, a new kid joined 2 of my classes about midway through the semester. It was the first semester of the school year, and out of nowhere he was just in my class one day. His name was Justin, and he sat next to me in one of the classes because there happened to be an open seat. I didn't really know where he had come from or why he had suddenly started going to my school. But as the semester went on, I sort of became friends with him. We didn't really have much in common, and he seemed a little bit weird, but we did sit next to each other in a class and also had the other class together, so he would often talk to me during class, and we would sometimes talk in the other one as well. Overall, I never knew him very well. I did ask him a few questions about himself. For example, I asked him what school he had come from before my high school. I also asked him if he had just moved to the area. He named a school that I had never heard of before and said that he had recently moved there. But aside from that, he didn't really share much about himself. Still, I was friendly with him, and I didn't mind talking to him here and there. He did get a little bit annoying though, because during the class where we sat next to each other, he would make a lot of comments. I figured that I might be one of the first people that he met in our city though. After probably like 2 or 3 weeks of him going to the school, he invited me to hang out. He said that I should come over to his house that night around 7 or 8. At first, in my head, I wasn't really sure if I wanted to, but I said yes because I realized I may as well hang out with him at least once. After school, I went home, and then he texted me at some time that night to come over. He gave me his address, and I got directions to go there. I had a car at this point, and I drove to Justin's house, which took maybe 10 minutes. He lived in a neighborhood that was not the greatest, but had a lot of smaller houses in it. I parked and then texted Justin that I was there. He did not respond right away, so I got out of the car and then walked to the front door and knocked on it. There was no response for at least a minute. I texted Justin again, and he told me to come inside. So I opened the door, which was unlocked, and then went in. After getting inside of his house, at first it seemed like nobody was home. Basically, all the lights were off, and I did not think that his parents were there. I called out saying hi, but didn't hear anything back at all. But there was what appeared to be a door leading to the basement that was open a little. So I took a couple of steps inside of his house, and then I started to hear a noise. It sounded like a TV or maybe a video game, but I could barely hear it, and it was coming from far away. When I got closer to the basement door, I realized that's where the sound was coming from. I figured Justin must be playing video games down in the basement, because I knew that he liked to play COD. I started heading down the basement stairs. The farther down I got, the louder the noises were, and I knew Justin had to be there. However, it was completely dark down there, and I literally could barely see anything. I didn't know where the light switches were or anything, so I just followed the sounds. Soon, I made it to the bottom of the stairs and headed to what looked like a hallway. I could only see some edges of the walls. As I was walking over there, I loudly asked Justin where he was and said that I was there. But I didn't get a response, which seemed kind of weird. A few seconds after that, as I was walking, I suddenly felt myself getting shoved from behind. I was pushed so hard that I fell forward onto the ground. After falling down, I heard some laughter from whoever pushed me. I looked, but it was so dark that I couldn't see who it was. They also quickly moved away, and I started to get to my feet, but then I was pushed again from behind. Then, when I was down, I got kicked in the legs. I heard more laughter from whoever this was. I quickly got to my feet again, and this time ran away to try to go back to the stairs. I heard somebody else moving down there, and I tried my best not to run into anything. I never thought to take out my phone and use it for light or anything, but I also didn't really have much time for that. After running back towards the stairs, I was luckily able to make it. I sort of tripped over the first part of the stairs, but I caught myself. I then ran up and left the house. I ran all the way back to my car and then drove home. I texted Justin when I got back, asking him what on earth that was all about. He didn't respond though. The next day was a Saturday, so we didn't have school, and the following Monday he was in class. However, I did not feel like saying anything to him and just ignored him, and he did the same to me. Normally he would talk to me and was borderline annoying, because I didn't really have much interest in many of the things he would talk about. This day he said nothing at all, and it remained that way for the next few days as well. And randomly after that, he just wasn't in class anymore. He must have changed schools again or something, and I never saw him again. I still wonder what went on in his basement. I believe that was him pushing me, and it makes me angry. I'm glad that I was able to get away though. This is something that happened back when I was in high school. I'm a female and was a senior during this time. School got out every day at 2:40 p.m. During this time, for about 10 minutes, it would just be crazy on campus. The school was fairly large, and everybody would be scrambling to get out of there. The locker commons and hallways were very crowded, and then everybody would leave the school. But one day I was able to leave school early. I was in an advanced class during the final period of the day, and it only had about 15 students in it. We had a really big test that day, and that was the only thing that we had. When we finished, our teacher said that if we drove ourselves to school, we could just leave. Most of the time, even if there was nothing to do in class, in high school the teacher would not let you leave until the bell. So this was really nice, and I got done with my test about 10 minutes before the class would normally get out. I left the classroom and then went to my locker. Then I walked out to the parking lot. During this time, I parked in the main students' parking lot, which was at the west end of the school, and also sort of behind it. After leaving the school, I was walking to my car, and it was strange to be leaving without tons of other people around. Normally there was hundreds of kids going to their cars, and there would be a traffic jam to leave campus. But now I could actually take my time. I remember looking around, but when I did, I noticed something a little weird. There was a small wooded area at the back corner of the parking lot behind it, and there was a man standing there to the side of a tree. He was looking in my direction, and he was wearing sunglasses. It looked pretty strange, because it seemed like he was coming out of the woods. The guy was too old to be a student as well. I looked back to him, and he then moved behind a tree and out of my sight. I continued to my car and then got inside and drove home. I didn't think much more about it after that. But the next day after school, I was walking to my car again. This time, I left school at the normal time with everybody else, and there were tons of other people around. When I was walking to my car, for some reason, I happened to remember the previous day and seeing the weird guy in the woods. Maybe it was just because I was walking to my car again, but I decided to look over to the woods once more, thinking there was no chance that the guy would be there again. But he actually was. The same guy was in the same exact spot, and it was really hard to notice him or see him at all unless you were looking for him. He was halfway behind a tree. I was wondering who on earth this guy was and what he was doing. I kept looking at him as I walked to my car, and the guy seemed to actually be looking at me. Soon, though, he disappeared behind a tree again. After that, I continued to my car and drove home. It was really strange, but I didn't think too much more about it until the next day. This time when I was leaving school, I knew to look to the spot, but I didn't see the guy this time. He was not there like he had been the last couple of days. The next strange thing to happen was when I left school to drive home, maybe 2 days after that. I was driving back and noticed that this one car followed me almost the entire time. I didn't notice it until maybe about halfway. There was a smaller black sedan that was driving behind me, not really close or anything, but the car did stick with me going into the area where I live, which was normally very quiet. I lived in a large neighborhood, but it was also a very quiet neighborhood. I had to make several turns in the very residential area, and we were the only 2 cars on the road. I looked back and noticed that the driver was wearing sunglasses. Could this be the same man? I didn't know, but it did seem strange. At my street, I turned onto it, and so did the car following me. I wasn't sure what to do at the time. I just drove to my house and pulled into the driveway. Luckily, the car did not pull in after me, and it kept going. I was very relieved. I went inside after that. For the next few hours, things went by pretty normally. That evening, though, I was in my bedroom sitting at my desk. There was a window in my bedroom, which looked out to the front yard into the street. I remember noticing that there was a guy walking down the street. It didn't take long until I recognized him. He was wearing sunglasses, and it appeared to be the same man who was at my school, and probably followed me home. He was slowly walking sort of down our street, and I noticed him looking in the direction of our house. When I realized this, I left my bedroom and found my parents in the living room. I told them the whole story of everything. They went to look out of a front window after that. Now at this point, I expected the man to be long gone, but when we looked out of the window, he was actually still in sight. He was walking by, now on the other side of the street, very slowly. My dad then left the house and started walking over to the guy. I couldn't hear what was being said, but it sounded like my dad was yelling at the man. And then I saw the guy start sprinting away. He went down the street and out of sight. My dad came back in after that and said that the guy got away from him. After that, the man did not come back towards our house again, and I never saw him at the school either. But I did report him to my school counselor, so if the guy ever returned, he probably would be caught. I really don't know who he was, but I'm glad that I saw him out of my window that night, or who knows what would have happened. This is back when I was a high school freshman. I remember that during this time, I would get a ride to school with my older brother, who was a senior. We both played sports, but different ones. So one day, maybe a couple of months into the school year, we both had practice, but mine was early after school, and my brother's was later. When my practice got done that day, it was probably like 5 p.m., and my brother's practice was still going. All my teammates left except for one. One of my good friends on the team, Jack, was in a similar situation. His brother was also practicing. We sat around and were talking outside the gym areas for a while. Then we got bored and decided to walk around. School had been done for hours, so at this point, everybody was gone and the place was almost completely empty. We started just talking and walking around random hallways, just kind of wandering around. We were both freshmen and still fairly new to the school, but knew most of the place pretty well. I remember after walking around for a while, we found this staircase that neither of us knew about. It was in an older wing of the school, and there were doors in front of the stairway, but one of the doors was open. We were both curious, so we walked inside and started going down the stairs. They led to, I guess, what was the basement of the school. I wasn't even aware that the school had a basement. At the time, I was thinking it probably wasn't used for anything except maybe storage. When we both got down there, it was really dark. Most of the lights were off, but we found this one switch and a few lights to the hallway turned on. It was basically just one hallway with a few rooms in it. We walked down it and were just looking around. I think we were both just surprised that we even had a basement in our school. We were talking to each other and just looking around, when towards the end of the hallway we heard a door open. This really startled us because we had no idea that anybody else was down here. I mean, all the lights had been off, and this place didn't really seem like it was in use. The next thing that I knew, this guy walked out from a room and into the hallway. We both didn't know who this guy was and did not recognize him. He clearly did not work for the school. He was wearing nothing that would indicate that he was a custodian either. The guy had really short hair and was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He looked out at us but did not say anything. Then, after us both staring at each other for a few moments, the man started walking in our direction. The way that he was walking was sort of aggressive, if that makes any sense. As he was approaching, he told us to come to him. We both had a bad feeling about it though, and just turned around and quickly went back upstairs. After we had made it to the top, we both went away from that hallway. The man did not come upstairs and remained in the basement. We continued to walk far away. For the next 20 minutes or so, we walked up and down random empty hallways and talked about what had happened. Soon though, we got curious and decided to head back, not to go into the basement, but just to see into the hallway. When we returned, both of the doors leading to the basement were shut. I actually tried to open one, but it wouldn't open and seemed to be locked. We then walked away and headed back over towards the gyms. We then waited there until our brothers were done with practice. After that happened, I wondered who the guy was and what he was doing down there. I never saw him again. I also wasn't aware of the basement area being in any sort of use to the school during my entire time there, and I never went back down there again. For some background, I'm a female and was a junior in high school at the time of this story. The school I went to was fairly large and had lots of other students. I would say that I had a decent amount of other friends and my locker was near several of them. Each grade kind of had their lockers together in a certain area. The juniors were in a large locker common area near the science department. It was sort of at one end of the school. So the story really begins one day when I was at my locker in between classes. None of my friends were really around at that time, and there was a little space between me and everybody else. It would get extremely crowded during some times of the day then, so much so that it was hard to even open the lockers sometimes. It was nice that it wasn't busy this time, but then I noticed that there was this guy standing in my locker. I had never seen him before, and wasn't sure where he had come from. I assumed that he was a senior because he looked older. He approached me when I was at my locker and said hi. Then he proceeded to start a conversation with me. He asked me to skip class and leave school with him, saying we could hang out. Now, I didn't even know this guy, and I took school very serious, so I did not want to skip. I told him no, I had to go to class, and I said that he should do the same. He asked me to hang out with him after school then, and I said no, I was busy. I really did not want to hang out with him at all and was not interested. I then left the guy and said that I had to go to class now. He was still at my locker when I walked away. For the rest of that school day, I didn't see him. But the next day, he was back. I got done with the class and went to my locker only to find him there. He was standing right in front of it, kind of blocking it from me. I asked him to move, and he started asking to hang out again. He knew my name somehow, and I kept telling him that I didn't want to hang out. Luckily, this time some of my friends were around. When he didn't move, several of them asked him, and he finally did. After he left, I asked my friends who he was, and none of them knew anything about him. We all just assumed that he was a senior, and I just hoped that he would leave me alone. Well, later that day, after school, I was stopping at my locker before going home. When I did, the same guy was there. This time, he asked if I needed a ride home, and of course I said no. I drove to and from school every day. He tried convincing me, but I just walked away from him. Then I left school. Now, after this, I did not see him for a while, but I found out that he did not even go to our school. Apparently, he had tried getting several other girls to hang out with him as well. One of them reported him for harassment after he apparently followed her into a restroom. That's when they found out he wasn't a student. Nobody really knew who he was until like a week or two later. One of my friends showed me this news story online. It was of an attempted kidnapping of a local woman, which luckily the woman got away. The man was caught, and I saw that it was the same guy. It turns out he was 23 and not even in high school at all. No wonder he looked older. I really couldn't believe it, and I feel grateful that everybody ended up being all right and that the man was caught. I used to walk to and from school every day. This was when I was in high school, and during my freshman and sophomore years. Obviously, I didn't have my driver's license yet, but I also didn't like to ride the bus. We luckily lived close enough that I could walk to school, and we lived in a warmer climate where the winters were very mild. It would take me about 15 minutes to walk to the school, and I had no problem with it at all. We lived in a residential neighborhood, and I would take a couple of sidewalks to the high school. That was basically it. Most days I would walk all by myself, and at 7 o'clock in the morning things were very quiet. The roads were not very busy either, other than the occasional car passing by. One morning I was walking to school like any other day. I would say that I was about halfway there when I heard a vehicle approaching. To this point, there had been maybe a few cars here and there driving by, but I didn't really notice. So this car I did notice, because it started driving closer to me and slow like it was going to pull over. And then surprisingly, it did pull over. I looked over to the car wondering who it was. The window rolled down and there was a man behind the wheel. He asked me if I could use a lift to class. Clearly I knew better than to get a ride from a stranger, and I said no. The man said something like it was probably a really long walk, but I still said no thanks. At that point, he did drive away. I walked the rest of the way, wondering if the man could have been dangerous, or if he was just trying to be nice. He should know better, though, than to offer random high school kids rides. So after school that day, I was walking home. This was the very same day. So I was by myself on the sidewalk. and when I was nearing my neighborhood, but still a few minutes away, a car approached again. I didn't really think to notice if it was the same one, but I soon realized that it was. The car slowed down and went about as slow as I was walking. Once more, a man rolled down the window, and when I looked, I noticed that it was the same guy. He then asked me if I needed a ride. I told him no again, I did not need a ride. He said okay, and then drove off. I really couldn't believe that the guy had tried to get me to go into his car before and after school. Obviously, I was hoping that I would never see him again, but that was not the case. The very next morning, I was walking to school. Now, looking back, it's easy to say that I should have told somebody, and I should have took more precautions, but for some reason, being a young high schooler, I thought the man would not be back. I figured he would have gotten the hint, and the previous day would probably be the only day that I would see him. So as I walked to school on this morning, I was about halfway there, and I saw a car pass me by, which looked like the man's car. I got a bad feeling. The car passed me though, and for a moment I felt relieved. But then the car pulled over to the side of the road, about 40 or 50 feet in front of me. And this time it completely pulled over. It stopped and it looked like the engine was turning off. I had a terrible feeling. It seemed as though the man may get out. So I quickly turned and went into a random person's front yard. The sun was still sort of rising, so it was mostly dark out. I then went into the neighbor's backyard and then cut through a few more properties. I knew the area really well, and I continued to cut through more people's yards and take random streets. I was able to make it all the way to school like that, and did not see the man or his car for the rest of the way. When I got to school, I called my mom and told her about it, and I also told all my school friends throughout the day. Everybody was concerned for me and said that I should not walk home that day. My mom was working and offered to leave her job early, but I was able to get a ride with my friend Amanda. So after school, I rode on Amanda's bus with her and went to her house. The bus didn't go to my house at all because we had told the school that I was not going to be using it, so I wasn't assigned to a bus at all. So my mom picked me up from Amanda's, and then we contacted the school so I could be on a bus. After that, I rode the bus to and from school every day for the rest of the semester. Then I was able to get my driver's license and drove to school for the rest of my high school career. Luckily, I never saw that man again.